Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We have a great group of panelists, and Jeff will go through and introduce them in a second. But before we begin, I just want to thank our sponsor, NorCal Controls Energy Solutions. Without their support, this webinar wouldn't be possible, and we're really grateful for the opportunity to put on such a great presentation today for you all. Some miscellaneous items as far as we go through this webinar. There's a chat feature, so you can actually engage with the panelists and other attendees by using that. Feel free to ask questions, comment about the presentation. We'll be monitoring that throughout the webinar. And there's also a Q&A area. So if you have any questions for our panelists, ask them in the Q&A and we'll do our best to answer those towards the end of the webinar, perhaps throughout the presentation as well. If you have any questions, feel free to add them in the Q&A or in the chat area. We will be sharing a video recording of this afterwards to everyone who signed up as well. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Jeff Allen, the Executive Director at Forth. Jeff?
Hello, welcome to the webinar. Thank you for joining us. We have a great lineup today. My name is Jeff Allen. I'm Executive Director of Forth, and we are a trade association and advocate for electric and smart transportation with nearly 200 member companies across the country. And we are very pleased to partner with Solar Power Events on this webinar and other content. We're going to jump straight to our panel, and we're going to have each panelist talk for a few minutes about themselves, their work in this space, and the changes and opportunities that they're seeing emerge during the current pandemic. And then we're going to take questions. So please do share those questions in the chat box or in the Q&A. First up, we're going to hear from Kyle Pynn with Burns & McDonnell. Kyle, take it away.
Hello, everyone. My name is Kyle Pynn. I'm a director at Burns & McDonnell. And for anybody who doesn't know, Burns & McDonnell is a 120-year-old engineering and construction company. And my responsibility at Burns & McDonnell is our transportation electrification infrastructure team. So we're deeply engaged in a lot of projects across the country with electrification, both for utilities and also in the private sector. And those span from small installations for passenger vehicles all the way up to massive installations for transit agencies that are planning on full electrification. So I think that me personally and my team, when the pandemic struck, we all took a collective deep breath and said, oh gosh, what is this going to mean for us? And we really started to look at our different market segments and try to understand where things were going. And, we've seen some slowdown in some markets, some of the fringe markets, for instance, autonomous rideshare and the electric vertical takeoff and landing craft that are kind of at the early stages of vehicle development. Those both have had some delays, both from a production standpoint, project standpoint, even from a funding standpoint. But our utility programs are for the most part continuing on uninterrupted. And even though we saw like a significant decrease in ridership with the transit agencies, we're seeing that a lot of those transit projects are continuing. And I guess a good anecdotal example of that is working on a project with King County Metro up in Seattle. And part of that project was being funded by Seattle City Light. And when the pandemic struck, one of the things that Seattle City Light had to do as a precautionary method for its ratepayers was to reevaluate all of its capital spend. And they decided to pull back the funding on one of the transit projects. And it makes perfect sense from a utility standpoint. Interestingly enough, we thought that was going to push the project or delay the project. And instead, King County came back with a response of, we're going to self-fund and keep pressing on because it's so vital to our future. And now that we're starting to come, I guess, to another phase, I don't want to say come out of the pandemic, because if I'm watching the news, I'm not sure we're anywhere close to coming out of it, but we're seeing some, return to normalcy and some recovery and at least some direction. So I think like right after the stay-at-home orders really started to hit full effect, we saw driving, walking, and transit all take a deep dive. And we've got data from Apple that shows us that. And, that really between March and April, it took a steep decrease. And then we started to see a, like a flattening in April and then a recovery through May. And what we see as of like the data from the very beginning, the first week of June, shows us that we're actually plus 9% in driving from pre-COVID. We're still minus 3% in walking, and we're minus 63% in transit. And that really shows across the nation in the transit numbers. And people just aren't prepared to get back onto a bus or a train in this crowded, spaces with people that could be, asymptomatic and spreading the virus. And so it is interesting to see, that transition. And what also we've seen is that vehicle sales have made a slight recovery. We're still kind of hovering at about 10% reduction in normal. But one interesting little fact in that is that internal combustion engine sales have recovered less fast than EVs. EVs are coming back quicker. And so I think that's a really good indicator. And I think, one of the things that COVID really showed us is that, like, if we stop driving and we stop, production, how clean the air gets and how clear the water gets. And it really brought forth, I think, some things to people that maybe weren't paying attention to that. And I think that, that's going to have some residual effects going into the future. So very excited about this panel, and I'm going to turn it back over to Jeff.
Great, thanks, Kyle. Next up, we'll hear some introductory remarks from April Bolduc with S-Curve Strategies. April.
Hi, everyone. April Bolduc, S-Curve, and we help utilities, municipalities, and states launch their transportation electrification programs. And one of the things that we know mostly about those programs is that when you base your strategies around best practices, around creating alignment with stakeholders, and around the customer experience, is when those programs become successful. And I was reading a recent trend analysis that said the global EV charging infrastructure market was projected to reach 140 billion by 2030. And then grow beyond that at a 31% each year. So this is why we are seeing, such an uptick in programs being brought forth by utilities, and also just such a focus on the electric infrastructure market. And just in the US, for utility programs alone, we've seen $3 billion in investments being spent on these programs. And so most of them are focused on medium and heavy duty. And so we work to help them streamline those programs and what that looks like. And I think what's been interesting around what we're seeing in COVID is that from a utility perspective, and everything that Kyle just stated is why utilities are now doubling down on transportation electrification. And so we've seen a total ramp up in the number of transportation electrification departments within utilities across the country, because now is the time to put that foot on the pedal and really accelerate this market. And from my background, I also come from a utility, worked at San Diego Gas and Electric for a little over 11 years. And I remember when we started with one product, which was a electric vehicle time of use rate. And so now to see the transition growing into medium and heavy duty, it's really exciting to see that. We do know that the impacts from the COVID market did strongly impact just local dealers in our neighborhoods. We saw a lot of layoffs across the country at dealerships alone. And, when we talk about medium and heavy duty, we also focus on that residential market, because both need to accelerate in order for us to accelerate EV adoption in general. And there's just a lot of reports out there that talk about, for example, Bloomberg NEF has said that through 2040, we're going to see a huge impact in the amount of electric vehicles. But by 2022, that there's going to be more than 500 models of electric vehicles. So we are seeing this temporary dip in manufacturing and in-car sales. But again, we think that that is a temporary dip, and that it will ramp up. And I think what's important for utility programs to know is that, this is really the time to get your strategies in place, and to focus your efforts around how we're going to meet that need, which I think is really exciting when you talk about the number of investments that are being done here. Some of the things that I think that are emerging from these changes is, and also COVID impacts too, is just a lot of collaboration. So for example, there was a recent report out, the West Coast Clean Transit Corridor Initiative that's out this month. And so that was a project that I also worked on. And, that was where you see this collaboration of utilities on an entire coast getting together and looking at where are we going to be implementing infrastructure up and down the West Coast. There's also some reports with SEPA, the Smart Electric Power Alliance, and for example, how you can prepare for an EV future and how you can put best practices forth for utilities for their EV infrastructure. And so I think it's, when you get reports like that are a collaboration of, many utilities and some of the smartest people in the region around what is this future going to look like and how can we accelerate it? I think we've set ourselves up to be in a really exciting place.
Great. Thank you, April. Sorry for mangling your name there. Third, we're going to hear some introductory remarks from Chris Martin with Cupertino Electric, and then we'll go to questions. So please do start those questions coming.
Good morning. My name is Chris Martin. I am with Cupertino Electric. I'm a director for Cupertino. I oversee a lot of our large-scale programs, and one of those being our electric vehicle infrastructure work that we do. A little background on CEI. We are a 66-year-old electrical construction company based out of California. We do work nationwide, but are predominantly located on the West Coast. We are the fourth largest electrical contractor in the United States. And so a lot of the work we do in terms of transportation electrification and the electric vehicle work that we support is tied to IOU programs, large-scale efforts to install and large, both light duty and heavy duty and fleet infrastructures. So we're currently supporting a little over 150 to 200 active projects up and down the West Coast in terms of EV installs and site assessments and evaluations. The work that we've seen and the way we've seen COVID impact it lately has been primarily tied to a very temporary pause in construction and program evaluations. But that temporary pause was only a matter of weeks for the utility work. It was really what seemed like a collective deep breath and then kind of reevaluating the direction that it was heading in. And then there was the pent up demand for so many sites, so many projects to be under construction that it took right back off very, very quickly. And so we've seen very little impact in terms of our fleet programs and our large scale light duty infrastructure work. So we do think though that there will be a little bit of a hiccup in some of the funding that becomes available over the next couple of months for some of these projects and some of these programs, but that hiccup and that pause will be very temporary. The work that we're pursuing and the work that we're doing in supporting the IOUs, there's a renewed focus from them to support clean infrastructure, support clean transportation, and make a concerted effort to further their infrastructure on electric transportation. So looking forward to speaking to everyone this morning, and I'll turn it over to Jeff.
Great. So we have some questions starting to come in. Weave those into some of the ones that I wanted to ask you all. Why don't we jump first to discussion about policy? I think we all know that this is a space that is heavily impacted by policy at the state level, at the federal level, but particularly at the federal level, there's a lot of discussion right now around stimulus and infrastructure bills. So what do you see under discussion that you think could have a big impact? And what do you think the odds are of any of those things happening in the next several months? And if I can add a third part to the question, one of our listeners is curious, how can we collaborate better across the electric vehicle and renewables industry to make some of those things happen? So which of you wants to take that on first? Kyle?
Yeah, I'll be happy to jump in. Yeah. So I think there's a couple of things there. From the stimulus package standpoint, I think that I've been waiting with bated breath for a stimulus package for more than a decade. I think that there are a lot of there's been a lot of discussion out there. I think it's sometimes used as a political tool, which is unfortunate because there are a lot of really key and important infrastructure projects that are out there. The only upside to that is I think the longer that the policymakers wait to push that forward, the better the chance of getting, solid, clean transportation, policy measures integrated into that, and some really meaningful spending in that area. From an actual policy standpoint with the utilities, for the most part, I was going to say we haven't seen a big impact. Really, I think a lot of it is because the wheels, those mechanisms turn so slowly that we probably hadn't had an opportunity to see that yet. Our first kind of leading indicator, which is not a great one, is that the CPUC, the California Public Utility Commission, has kind of kicked the can, I guess is the right phrase. They're delaying a decision on Charge Ready 2. So the funding for Southern California Edison's next wave of spending in their Make Ready program. And I think that's probably not so abnormal for, I think, where a lot of PUCs are at across the country, is that people are waiting to see how things settle out, and so delaying or deferring some of those decisions is probably something we're going to see more of. So that's that's unfortunate, but there is still plenty of funding out there, and so I think we have yet to determine where we're going to settle, just because things move so slowly.
April?
And I think too, since we have seen just from a federal government standpoint, where overall we've seen them take a back seat when it comes to electric vehicles. I think what's been really exciting is seeing the state policies grow. And I know that Nevada was recently became the 17th state to adopt California's vehicle emissions standard. So a lot of states that we see are taking matters into their own hands and to electrify, so that we can see this exponential growth and that we can meet the state's goals that we are set for ourselves.
Yeah, I'll kind of echo what both April and Kyle said. The utility work and the utility wheels of motion affecting their programs is, as Kyle said, it's kind of a slow moving entity. So we don't see many impacts to that right now of items that are already in play. I think how the COVID and how the long-term effects of this play out is kind of yet to be seen, and that'll become more apparent over the next 6 to 9 months. The discussion of the Charge Ready program being slowed down by the PUC wasn't completely unexpected, but it is slightly concerning. But I think that there's going to continue to be such a renewed center of focus and effort to push clean transportation forward, that it's something that has to occur to meet these lofty goals and these accelerated timelines that so many different regulatory agencies are putting out there, that there cannot be a very long pause in any of these significant funding mechanisms that have to occur in order to get close to meeting these lofty endeavors.
Let me follow up on the question we had. I know we don't really have the lobby team here today, but the question around coordination, because I know we hosted a webinar recently where we had a half dozen different stimulus proposals from transportation electrification advocacy groups alone, not counting all the ones from renewable energy advocates or environmental advocates more generally. Any thoughts on either how do we kind of get these ducks more in a row, or on the other way you could take it is if you could bring people together around just one or two things that the federal government could do, how would you want to bring folks together?
Yeah, sure. I'll jump in because this is not my area of specialty, so I won't talk very long. I know that Burns McDonnell is engaged with the Alliance for Transportation Electrification, which is it's run by a fellow named Phil Jones, and he's a former commissioner. And really, what he's dedicated this organization to is helping different utilities develop their plan such that it would be, it's more likely to be approved by the PUC. So, at this point, we've had many successes with that. And so we have kind of this running tally of things that have worked and things that haven't worked. And so kind of refining that methodology. And, there's teams that move from state to state helping those different utilities kind of prepare for their filings. And I think that's critical. And then also just as a specialist in this industry, I've gotten involved in a couple of different, defenses of positions for filings. And I think that's something that as, interested parties in this, that, we all have a voice. And I think using that voice isn't anything in politics and policy can be impactful.
Okay, April or Chris, anything you want to add to that? Okay, moving right along. So we've talked a lot about the COVID-19 pandemic and impact that's having. I don't think we can have this conversation without also talking about the protests for racial justice and the Black Lives Matter movement. Are you seeing responses to that in the transportation electrification space, particularly, good examples of how utilities or other players are trying to center equity more in their programs? April, looks like you have something to say.
Yeah, I think it's been really exciting to see that utilities, a majority of the filings have included EV equity as a focus, and especially around medium and heavy duty, because we can't just electrify passenger vehicles without having a focus on EV equity and electrifying large scale transportation. And so, every neighborhood deserves clean air. And I think it's been fantastic to see the utilities including a focus there. I know that there also was recently Jeff with Fourth and also EV Noir did an EV equity workshop. And it was just fantastic to hear, this really focus on how can we move transportation electrification forward, and hearing from all the groups that are impacted, the utilities that are doing some fantastic things. And, there's legislation right now in California as to how do we implement charging infrastructure in a way that is equitable to all. And also, reducing emissions. And we know that a lot of locations where they are impacted by traffic and by high emissions, are these areas where we need to put that strong focus on EV equity. So it's been exciting to see the ramp up. I think that there's a lot more though that we could do, and that comes down to collaboration. And that's what we're seeing, especially over this COVID time, just lots of online and virtual seminars about how to implement EV equity into your programs.
Kyle and Chris, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I'll add to that.
Go ahead, Chris.
Thank you. So I'll add to that just very briefly. Prior to this most current social push for social justice, there's been a lot of, as April alluded to, a lot of legislation, regulation around EV equity being spread out through all communities. And there's been a focus on that, not saying it's perfect, but there has been a focus on that has been taking place, especially in California. And I think this most recent push for social justice and social equity is going to just further that cause and further that endeavor, because there's so many benefits that we've seen from I'll say from the air quality lately with less vehicles on the road, less internal combustion engines on the road, that it's pointing out that there really has to be a concerted effort to make sure that we have that clean air and that push for clean air spread across all communities, all areas, that everybody's entitled and has a right to that. So I think as we have more focus on social justice and social equity, we will see a bigger renewed focus from the utilities, regulators, and the legislation pushing that across the board.
Yeah, I'm really just going to echo what April and Chris have both said. I think that there were some interesting programs already in place, because I think we can all agree that clean air shouldn't be a privilege of the wealthy. And it doesn't take long to do some mapping and figure out that a lot of our heavy truck routes, where there's trucks that are idling for long periods of time, are going through neighborhoods that are already challenged economically. And so those were conversations that have been happening for a while. But I think that this renewed focus, specifically on social equity and race equity, I think it's really caused a lot of folks to take a step back and say, we need to rethink these things, and we need to be bringing all different folks into these conversations and having robust conversations. And I think that's the most important thing, is to not assume that we know what those needs are, but to really have meaningful conversations with community groups and understand what their needs are, so that we're spending that equity, spending that capital in an equitable fashion. So I think really sitting down and listening is the first step in this, and I think that's what this movement has really done for a lot of organizations, is caused everybody to take a step back and say, we really need to take a stronger look at this and bring more folks into the discussion.
Thanks. And since April was kind enough to give us a shout out, I will mention that Fourth and EV Noir are organizing a full day conference on e-mobility and equity in November, which has definitely seen more interest in that in the last few months, which is great. Maybe specifically, we had a question here about jobs, which I think this question gets to also, of are you seeing a renewed focus or opportunity in trying to find ways to make sure that the jobs being created in this industry and in EV charging are going to communities of color and traditionally underserved communities? Or do you see opportunities for creating more job opportunities in small and women and minority-owned businesses as this industry grows? April, looks like you want to jump on that.
I definitely see that. I am have a woman-owned business, and what I really like that I'm seeing is that utilities, especially as part of their programs or part of their RFPs, they're requiring that communities of color are benefiting from these programs. And so we've definitely seen a ramp up of that. And we've also seen a lot more outreach from utilities to these organizations, and saying, if they're going to participate, if your company is going to participate in a program, you need to have that diverse business enterprise component as part of that program. And we need more of that. And there are utilities that are doing really well at it. And then, we could definitely see a ramp up across the country, though, for these projects, for sure.
Yeah, I see the current situation that we're in. It's a double-edged sword. It's an unfortunate double-edged sword. I think that, that as April mentioned, a lot of utility programs already have, very robust requirements in place for minority business entities and for women-owned business entities and disabled veteran business entities. And there's lots of, good programs out there that are making a real difference. What has been really difficult in the past 2 months, since the pandemic struck, is that I think a lot of small businesses that fall into those categories have taken such a hit because they didn't have the means that the larger companies had to continue running uninterrupted. And so what we've seen is as we're going out to bid for projects, we've had a lot of no bids from folks that normally would have submitted bids for us because they didn't feel that they were in a position to continue functioning. It's like where the large companies that had cloud-based servers and robust web hosting functionality, and everybody with a laptop was able to send all their folks home, and they just kept moving without a beat. missing a beat, and I think smaller companies really suffered, and I think that's hurting what we're trying to accomplish here. And so I don't have a great solution for it, but we definitely saw some small businesses suffer here in the last couple of months, and so we're hopefully as we come out of the pandemic, that's going to be easier to get those folks stood back up.
Yeah, I'll kind of echo a little bit what was said by Kyle and April. Is a lot of the utility programs do have very robust requirements and pushes towards serving traditionally underserved communities and supporting minority-owned, women-owned, disabled, veteran-owned businesses. I know as part of the work that we're doing and we're ongoing, every site that we do construction on and every site that we support, we have some component of whether it's a disabled veteran-owned business supporting us in some form or fashion, a minority-owned business, or a woman-owned business entity helping us through those processes. It's something that it's one, a requirement from the utility to help meet their goals and their needs, but also from our perspective, it's the right thing for us to be doing, and it's the right push for us. And in many ways, what we gain out of it and what they gain out of it, it's mutually beneficial. So we're making a very big concerted effort to continue to push and utilize those traditionally underserved businesses. And as I said, every site we're working on currently has some form of that in it.
Okay, let's change gears a little bit. We had a couple of questions about consumer awareness and engagement, one of my favorite topics. I think it's pretty well known that even in California, something like half of car buyers can't name a single electric vehicle model, and that hasn't been improving. And so I think the question is, what strategies have you seen or do you see coming that will help move the dial on that? Or what advice would you have for folks on how we make progress there? April?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we have to think about is whenever we're launching a program of any sort is what is that customer experience going to look like? Because the ultimate goal is to have them adopt electric vehicles. So whether your program is focused on passenger vehicles, or if your program is focused on medium and heavy duty, let's take a fleet operator, for example. So if they're looking at transportation electrification, how can we simplify the process so that that fleet owner looks to transportation electrification as, oh, this is, I see the steps that we need to take. I can participate in this program. This is exactly how I'm going to get the infrastructure. You have to be able to streamline that program. That even starts back from, especially for utilities, when they're thinking about how do we implement our program from the inside out. And so all of those steps that you look at internally actually affect the customer engagement, because as you're bringing customers along and bringing them down the path of electrification, you really have to simplify the steps and then also the message for us all to reach that goal of transportation electrification. And SEPA is going to be coming out with a report next month that I was also a part of, and that's best practices for utility EV infrastructure. So it's going to give a step-by-step program on how to streamline that. But like I said, everything that you do internally definitely has a direct impact on externally and on that customer engagement to ensure that they are adopting electric vehicles in the most quickest way possible.
Yeah, I think it's clearly there's a lot of different facets to this. There are so many different ways to get to communicate information to people, and people take information in a lot of different ways. And I think it's going to be some combination of advertising, of building out infrastructure and people seeing it in their neighborhood. It's going to be deploying, electric buses and electric trucks, and those drivers experiencing that technology and realizing what its capabilities are, and then taking that message home. I was working on a project in the Northern Virginia area, and I just happened to be at a hotel, one morning and getting breakfast, and one of the Electrify America ads came on, and it was the Flintstones one, what ensued was I saw a group of construction workers next to me who jumped into a conversation, and one of the young fellows at the table was basically saying, "Oh, that's electric. What a bunch of fill in some words there, and he clearly wasn't sold by the advertisement. And another gentleman that was at the same table, clearly in the same crew, said, hang on, wait, and he started explaining to him different things about what they understood, and it really inspired a conversation, and it was really good to see people talking about it. And I think that there are so many ways to get the message out, and we just have to continue to take bites at the elephant.
Yeah, I maybe put a finer point on it. This may be a tricky one because we love all of our children, but I think there's a question about specific utilities that folks think are doing a good job. Obviously utilities have been doing this for decades with energy efficient appliances and other programs. They're, a little bit newer to this game, but there are a few examples of programs or utilities that we would want to call out.
At least from the fleet perspective, because again, when we talk about fleets, we're also talking about EV equity, because we're talking about how we're going to get cleaner air, from medium and heavy duty vehicles. And the utilities that I know are doing it well are ones that actually have tools on their website to help fleet owners look at total cost of ownership and to look at vehicle availability. There's organizations like CalSTART who have their Drive to Zero initiative, but on their website, you can look and see what vehicles are available today and how long it's going to take those vehicles to reach those fleets. And I think, again, when we're simplifying this, especially for the commercial customer, that's really important. And then the same on the residential side. San Diego Gas and Electric, they do a good job at with their initiatives on how they're communicating about electric vehicles to their residential customers. And when you do it in a fun and interesting way, but again, the message towards simplification, I think that's really key, is how is it going to be easy for you? And then lastly, I think, it's also knowing your audience. And so as we hit the mainstream, where initially there was a lot of focus on the environment and what it can do there, but we also know that the vehicles are just plain fun to drive. And I think a lot of times that message is missed in advertising campaigns. And so I think Kyle brought up a good point about the Electrify America ad, because that was one of the most fun ads that I had seen. And you really are talking about fun, and we can't leave that perspective out of the message.
Great. Chris, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I was going to say something else, but I'll mention the fun to drive. I think that is one of the things that clearly gets missed in a lot of this. Is they really are a great experience to drive and operate. A lot of these vehicles are just very high quality vehicles that are fun to drive. In terms of some of the utilities doing well, I won't name anyone specifically, but I will talk about Cal EVIP and the California Energy Commission. I think they have have a lot of really good resources out there and have made a lot of really good tools available to potential site owners, site hosts, or even end users, that helping outline what the total cost of ownership is, what the impacts and how this is going to help them in the long run. And they've done a really good job of helping that education process come along. And there's a lot of really great resources out there through those folks and through their websites that can really benefit all parties involved.
Now, I'll take in there real quick, Jeff. I think two utilities that are interesting, from my perspective, for two different reasons. First of those is Kansas City Power and Light, who's now Evergy. They made a very bold decision, before they had PUC approval to go ahead and build out a network of chargers in the Kansas City area. And there were a lot of people who were, pulling their glasses down and taking a look at the management of KCP&L at the time and saying, God, what are you doing here? And their firm belief was that, if you build it, they will come. And what we've seen is a significant increase in, vehicle, EV adoption in the Kansas City area. And it's directly attributable to the concept that people have less range anxiety when there's public charging available. The other utility that I haven't worked with, but I've kind of seen from afar is Austin Energy. I think they have just this really, really creative and inventive ad campaign, and I would encourage anybody to go out and take a look at it if you haven't seen it. They've got Stevie, the EV T-Rex, and he's become kind of an icon in the EV community. And so I think like really getting at people and making it fun is important. And I think the concept of being bold in some of your decisions is important as well, like KCP&L was.
Great. Okay. So we have a couple of questions I'm going to put in the crystal ball category. So some future predictions. One is along with electrification of heavy duty trucks, which I think is coming a lot faster than most of us expected. There's obviously a lot of discussion around autonomous heavy duty vehicles. Any thoughts about how quickly that's coming and whether that might have been changed by recent events? Kyle, I'll let you have first stab at this one.
Yeah, sure. I do think it has been impacted a little bit, mainly because a lot of the operations of that we're doing the development of that autonomous technology, it isn't in a full production mode and it wasn't classified as critical infrastructure yet. So, folks that were, at a lab, developing, pieces and parts for these vehicles, got sent home, and, it's really not pragmatic to try to build these pieces and parts in your living room or your apartment in San Francisco or Los Angeles. So, we really saw, a hit there, but I also think, policy is dragging very slowly. I think, I had expected to see more policy movement by this point, and I think because of that, it's definitely causing some delays in deployment of this technology. Even when the technology is ready, I think it's going to be, policy is going to be a hindrance. I mean, there's some things that you look at different laws that are in place, and you say, well, gosh, there's a law that says that you have to have a steering wheel, you have to have brake pedals, you have to have mirrors. And you know that those laws came to be because, some smart aleck, 100 years ago decided he was going to, make a car without a steering wheel and do it with like pull strings or something, and got into an accident. And so it's unfortunate that those laws stay on the books, and it is unfortunate that folks who aren't interested in seeing this technology progress are using those laws to combat it. So we have a ways to go, and that was even before the pandemic, but we've definitely seen some impact from the pandemic in causing delays in production.
Chris, April, do you have anything to add to that, or should we move to the next prediction? Question about another of these perennially just around the corner technologies, vehicle to grid or vehicle to home or bi-directional charging, which has been discussion for the decade or so I've been doing this. So what developments do you see there? And again, how, if at all, has that changed in the last few months? Chris?
I don't think we've seen any drastic change in the last couple of months on vehicle to grid or bi-directional charging. It has been a topic for quite a while now, the importance of this and the need for it. Nothing's changed in the last several months. There's so much that has to take place for that to be a truly effective use of the vehicle and to truly be a long-term viable solution. I think there's policies that need to be changed. There's regulations that need to be changed. It's nothing that's going to happen overnight in any way, shape, or form. And some of the technology still needs to catch up with it a little bit to make this truly viable. I think I'll call it the holy grail. It's a great concept and it's a great thing to get out there, but I think we're a long ways away from it truly being a truly large scale viable opportunity.
Yeah, I agree with Chris 100%. It's unfortunate because we have been talking about it for a long time. Two things I think are interesting. One of them is a reality and one of them is rumor. The reality is that there are more electric school buses coming online, and more programs are going to be funding electric school buses. And I think because of the way that vehicle manufacturers structure their warranties, that's been one of the biggest hindrances to vehicle to grid technology is if you say, I'm going to hook my vehicle up to this charger and the utility is going to be able to take some energy back out of that as needed, even small amounts. A lot of the vehicle OEMs have said, no, look, that's going to void your battery warranty. And there's not too many folks who are going out and spending, $30, $35, $40, $50,000 on a vehicle and saying like, okay, I'm all right if a major component of the drivetrain now no longer has a warranty because I allowed the utility to take a little bit of power back off of it. So with the school buses, I think what's really important there is it's much easier to say like, look, we're the school district, it's important to us to have this, this relationship with the utility, and we're going to work with the vehicle manufacturer. We're going to come up with a program where we're not worried about what the warranty on the battery looks like. And then the other development that's more of a rumor is it's unconfirmed, but a lot of the trade magazines are saying that Tesla has had V2G capability in their cars for the last couple of years and just haven't made it public yet. And so I think there's folks that are working on it in the background, and if somebody like Tesla was to come forward and say like, hey, we're ready, and they were able to to work out something as far as the warranty, that could make us a significant change in people's thinking about this in a very short order.
Yeah, I think that we can't stress the importance of having the automaker being the one that's helping to lead this charge for vehicle to grid, because a lot of people assume that cars can do it, or maybe it's a component that's not part of the vehicle. But we really do, if we're going to see this move forward, need to see that leadership from the automakers.
And I think it's worth noting for folks too, feel free to weigh in, that you can get a lot of the benefits people are interested in just through smart and managed charging. How fast and when does the power go into the car? So it's one of these where you can get a lot of the good for a lot less effort. I would love to dig a little deeper on the school bus piece, because I do think larger batteries, more predictable use case, fewer players. I know there's dozens of demonstration projects going on around the country with school buses, but I'm curious if you have any thoughts on what's it going to take to move from sort of the science project to a scalable, large scale program, and what kind of timeline are we looking at there?
From my perspective, because I'm currently working with the San Diego Unified School District on a project, and we won a Carb grant to really develop what does that template look like for electrification of transportation for districts, and even starting with one high school. How do we template that so that every school district then in the country could use that? How do we also implement solar and battery storage into that project? And so it really is a partnership with the utilities, because as we've discussed, especially COVID has hit schools and districts extremely hard. And so they're wrestling with, well, if I have an entire bus, am I only now putting a handful of students on that bus? And what does that look like? So then they need even more vehicles. And so, we've been getting really creative around solutions as to, okay, well, could you even, you have this electric bus in a pandemic situation, could you teach on the bus? Could you, because you aren't going to be able to have kids as close together when they're coming back to school. So, the pandemic is really challenging school districts, especially those that are ready to electrify today, with their programs on how they're going to implement that. But again, they do need that investment from the utilities, also investments to help with purchasing the buses, because they're not going to be able to afford it at this stage, especially due to the pandemic.
Great. Any other thoughts on that issue? And if not, I have one more in the sort of the future tech category, which is somebody asked about solar roads, and maybe more generally, you could talk a little bit about wireless charging, and which I think is further along than most people on this call probably think it is in terms of technology, but maybe another one that it's a long gap between the technology and the implementation. But I'm curious what you all think about that.
Yeah, we've definitely seen some really interesting demonstrations out there. And, I've actually testified before a couple of different, departments of transportation as they're trying to get their arms wrapped around, what the future looks like for electrification. And for better or for worse, the middle of the country is still grappling with the concept that as electrification comes, they have to figure out how to pay for the roads, because most of the roads are being paid for through a gas tax. And so a lot of discussion about that and how to get that figured out. And most of these departments of transportation have such little funding to maneuver, to get their work done, repairs done, and intersection upgrades, completed, that, we're struggling to get them to commit to making small concessions like, hey, we're gonna work on this 40-mile stretch of interstate. Can we lay some additional conduit so we can get fiber in there so that we can be, have smart technologies on the road? And that's been a challenge. So it's really, I think, about the dollars. One of my mentors a long time ago said, whenever anybody says it's not about the money, it's always about the money. So I think in this case, the technologies are there. There's a lot of really interesting things, but in the funding mechanisms, the money is really the impediment to seeing those things come about any time in the near future.
Great. Well, we're coming up on the top of the hour. I want to make sure we get to a couple more things. So one is, I suspect we have a lot of electric utilities and folks who work with electric utilities on this call. What kind of advice would you give to them, particularly if they're pretty new to the transportation electrification space? What are some, ways to put a toe in the water and start to get engaged?
Yeah, I would say that no matter how small or large your team is that's actually implementing electric vehicles, is that in order for a utility program to be successful, you have to have the customer experience be top of mind. And so when you're looking inward to develop your program, and especially if you are just a program with just a couple of folks on it, you can leverage your other internal departments to help build that customer experience. So the size of your team, should not preclude you from having an amazing customer experience and planning that way, because we're only going to get the mainstream adoption if customers find it easy to make their transportation electric.
Yeah, I'll echo what April said there. Starting with the customer in mind and the customer experience is the first and foremost thing that I would look at. The programs that we've worked on that have had the most success have had good customer experiences and the customer in mind whenever they started the program and how they viewed their approach to it. Ones that have struggled are where that isn't the first forethought of how is the customer's experience going to be. Because in a lot of ways, there is a cost out of pocket for these customers to make this transition, to make this shift. And so it's starting with that education, and it's starting with this needs to be an easy, accessible thing for them to get involved in and support. Otherwise, it will have a very slow traction to begin with. And there are so many utilities have so many touch points to so many different customers that there are so many different groups that you can leverage as an organization and as a company to truly help make that a really good customer experience for them.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that, and maybe come at it from a little bit different angle, is for the commercial customers. I think it's really important for utilities to start having conversations, to do some outreach to large trucking logistics companies, to their transit agencies within their territory, because I think a lot of times those organizations have engineering departments or management departments that really have such a a minute relationship with the utility because their dependence has been on fossil fuels, and so they really don't know how to begin a conversation with the utility. So I think it's incredibly important to speak, often with those folks and create a an outreach program to talk to the trucking companies and to the transit agencies, because that electrification is coming their way and they may not know how to approach the utility, and they may be looking at it as something like, oh, well, I can get that power, closer to the end after we figured some more things out. And what oftentimes they don't realize is that, if they're needing, 15 or 20 megawatts of power, it takes an awful lot of time to make that power available for them where they need it. And so, reaching out to those folks, I think, is incredibly important.
That's great. Yeah, I think that's so what I'm hearing is, first of all, this is when worlds collide, right? You have large transportation players, utility players, local governments working together in new and different ways. So that's going to take some time. And then the other thing that I hear is start with your customers, listen to your customers, which is always good advice. And I would add, from an equity standpoint, most utilities have great relationships around low-income programs and organizations in the community that work with folks to help them pay bills, which is a great place to start if you want to learn about their mobility challenges and how electric vehicles can help there. So start with customers, listen a lot, start early, words of wisdom. I think we want to wrap it up. I'll give you all a last lightning round chance if there's one thought you want to leave people with. And before I do that, it's probably worth mentioning the other advice for people getting into this space. There's a lot of resources on this call, and Solar Power Events, I know, does a lot of events and webinars in addition to things like National Smart Energy Week. I know Forth has webinars and a newsletter. I know any of you would be happy to hear from folks on the call. So there's a lot of other resources out there folks can use to get smart. But with our last minute or so, I'll say thank you again to our speakers and ask any last thought you want to leave folks with. April.
I was just going to say, make customer experience a priority. And fleets, as we know them, they aren't currently key accounts at utilities. So keep that in mind, that our fleet customers are something that we need to do a lot of outreach to.
Great. Kyle?
Final thoughts would be drive electric and spread the word. Don't miss an opportunity to have a conversation at the family picnic with an aunt who you haven't seen in a while, and tell them about what you're doing and tell them why it's important for the world.
Great. Chris?
Yeah, the last thing I would say is it doesn't matter the size of the utility or the size of what you're trying to accomplish. It's great to get started early and start the conversations with your stakeholders very early, and get all the necessary stakeholders on board from the very beginning. Never too early to start that engagement.
Great. Well, thank you again to all of our speakers. As a reminder, we will send a recording of this webinar around to everyone who signed up. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.